In this first session, we will have 3 speakers. We will have with us physically here in the room Desiré Pacheco, and outside online we will have 2 other speakers, Panikos Georgallis, and we also have Simone Schiller-Merkens. Let me briefly introduce the 3 speakers, and afterwards how we organize the session. The first speaker will be Panikos Georgallis. Panikos is an assistant professor of strategy at the Amsterdam Business School in the University of Amsterdam. And Panikos' research focuses on the intersection of strategy, organizational theory, and sustainability. Panikos is going to give a presentation on the social movements and the evolution of moral markets. The second speaker will be Desiré. Desiré Pacheco is an associate professor of entrepreneurship at IESE, Universidad de Navarra, and her research focuses on sustainable businesses at the interface between institutions, entrepreneurship, and firm strategy. Desiré will give a presentation on social movement and entrepreneurship. And the third speaker is Simone Schiller-Merkens. Simone is a senior researcher at the Witten Herdecke University in Germany. Her research focuses on the relationship between broader societal challenges such as moralizations or the turn towards the growth and post-capitalism, and the relationship between these broader societal challenges and the organizing of fields and organizations. Simone will give a presentation on organizing toward an alternative economy, social movement, and alternative organizing. The idea is that each presenter will take about 15 minutes to give the presentation, and at the end, we are going to have about 20-25 minutes for a debate with the audience. So I give the floor to Panikos so he can start with the presentation.
Well, thank you very much, and many thanks to the organizers, both from the program side and the technical side. I think this is, it seems to be very well organized. Very ambitious to do this in a hybrid form, and I think so far the experiment is working. So let me share my screen, and you can tell me. You can tell me if you can see and hear it in 1 minute. So can everybody see and hear me? Okay, perfect. So let me get started then. Many thanks again to the organizers. I wanted to also say that I'm very excited to be here with 2 other great panelists, with Simone and Desiré, who've done great research in this area. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. What I will present today is also a hybrid in the sense that when Daniel invited me to present, he said that I could present published work or work in progress, and I decided to do a little bit of both. So I'll give you some insights from the work I've done in the past, but also a teaser on recent work or work in progress that I'm doing now, looking at the impact of social movements on moral markets and the evolution of these markets. So first things first, what we typically think of social markets, moral markets to be, how we conceptualize them, is markets whose purpose, or at least one of the primary purposes, is to create social value, addressing social or environmental problems through the market. So examples of these are market for recycling, grass-fed meat, socially responsible investing, renewable energy, fair trade goods, and so on. These are products that are typically considered to be normatively superior compared to alternative products, and because of that, they tend to be promoted by actors that are driven by moral considerations, and most of the research in this area has identified that social movements and social movement organizations have been fundamental for the development of these sectors. And some of this work, including work by Desiré, who's in this panel, shows that the involvement of social movement organizations changes the usual patterns of industry development. So these sectors develop in different ways compared to sectors that do not involve these players. Now, what are the contributions of social movements to market formation? If we split it to kind of supply side and demand side contributions, on the supply side, we can say that the diagnostic framing, so the identification, so the diagnosis of a problem prompts the search for alternative solutions to address that problem. Prognostic framing, so identifying particular solution, draws attention to those business opportunities, be it in organic or renewable or ethical fashion and so on, and induces motivation of entrepreneurs and other participants who want to be involved in these areas. And in addition, social movements, in some cases, they also act as mediators who provide information about these opportunities that leads to reduction of uncertainty and lowers the cost of search for producers who might be involved. On the demand side, the involvement of these activists, these social movements, enables the legitimacy of these markets. It can often induce changes in consumer preferences. It makes consumers more likely to adopt these products or services, and they often are involved in helping create industry infrastructure or market infrastructure, such as policy frameworks that are favorable to these markets. Now, a lot of the research on this topic, especially looking at social movements, has come from organization theorists, organizational sociologists, and has focused a lot on the market level of analysis, how social movements influence markets. Typical outcome variables that have been studied are entrepreneurial activity or entry rates or market growth. So usually the focus has been at the kind of macro level, the market level. Because of that, often this research has ignored firm heterogeneity, differences across firms in whether they enter these markets or not. At the same time, research in strategy that looks at market entry tends to focus on firm heterogeneity a lot, especially looking at resources and capabilities and how they lead companies to engage in some new markets or not, but has not paid a lot of attention to the social context of market entry decisions. So what we have is a symmetrical gap in the literature where, while we know a lot about the influence of social movements on markets overall, we know less about why some firms enter moral markets while others do not. Now, as mentioned earlier, there are a lot of things that social movements do to spearhead the development of moral markets, and some of them speak to helping identify the opportunities. Others affect actually the how attractive these opportunities are and the valuation of opportunities, eventually leading firms to enter these markets. But the identity of the organization, of the focal firm, might also affect how these influences of social movements are translated or how they're filtered. So the inducements for firms to enter moral markets or the pressures that they face depend on who they are as an organization. So why is organizational identity important? We know from prior work that identity labels or identity frames, so what people perceive the organization to be, members of the organization but also outsider, changes their strategic direction. So some earlier research has shown that after the breakup of AT&T into regional companies, these were like essentially smaller companies that had the same culture and the same history and the same resources, but they identified themselves differently as a telecommunications company versus a multimedia company. And that led them to enter very different types of markets and go in different strategic directions. Another example comes from Patagonia, which entered a market that is seemingly unrelated with its earlier practices. This is a clothing company, but it entered the market for organic goods. And the reason is that this is consistent with the identity of the company as one that is trying to solve the environmental crisis. So what we're arguing here is that market entry depends also on the correspondence between the identity of the company and the market opportunity. So if we think about how this would play out in a conventional market, well, what we know about conventional markets is that when firms have an identity that is congruent with the market opportunity, that guides managerial attention, it filters the attention of decision makers and makes them more likely to attend to that opportunity and potentially enter. On the other hand, when the identity is challenging to, when the market opportunity, is challenging to the identity of the company, usually they fail to see these opportunities. They don't really grasp their attention. But something different happens when we're talking about moral markets. And the reason is the involvement of social movements. Because social movements point to solutions, firms with a congruent identity will become aware of market opportunities, and maybe even more so compared to conventional markets. But the biggest difference is that diagnostic framing, so the fact that social movements also try to point to the problem and the agents that are responsible to the problem, makes it so that firms with oppositional identities also become aware of these opportunities because they become the targets of activists, or because other firms in their industry become the targets of activists. So that affects the possibility that they will identify these opportunities. It's a little bit different when we're talking about evaluating opportunities. As mentioned earlier, social movements can make markets more attractive, either by inducing demand or legitimacy, or helping create market infrastructure. And because a congruent identity is typically linked to more positive evaluations, the fact that the market is also more attractive, that will make firms with a congruent identity more likely to enter. But firms with oppositional identities, they also have something to benefit. They also benefit from increased demand and better industry infrastructure and policy frameworks and so on. But they also face some risks of being criticized as inauthentic or greenwashers when they enter these markets. So what we expect is that in moral markets, the likelihood of market entry will be stronger for firms that have a congruent identity compared to those with an oppositional identity. But still, because the ones with an oppositional identity are still going to be made aware of opportunities, they still have something to benefit, the likelihood of market entry will be stronger for them compared to those with an unrelated identity. And the bottom line here is that while we think of institutional pressures as typically leading to isomorphism, what we see in moral markets is that the presence of social movements leads to greater organizational diversity. We see firms with a congruent identity, so the good guys, let's say, coming in, but also some firms that have an oppositional identity. We see some of the Walmart going into organic, or some of the big oil companies going into renewable energy. So how does that help us understand and theorize about the evolution of moral markets? Well, let's see what might be the key elements of a theory about that. So clearly, contributions by social movement organizations are really important. If not a distinguishing feature of moral markets, they're certainly typical, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. The other piece of the puzzle is what I argued just now, is that the presence of social movements can lead to greater diversity of the organizations, of the firms that are involved in these sectors. And that's important because having diverse firms helps provide the diverse resources that are needed to develop a market. At the same time, it also can make it difficult to establish collective identity, to coordinate between producers because they have very different motivations and very different identities, and coordinate to promote the market. So it can also create problems. Now, the fact that we have this diversity of firms being part of this industry, but also other players, including social movement organizations, is important because it also suggests that we have to think about the interdependencies between them. Doesn't matter, for example, if Greenpeace is promoting the solar sector or if it's a trade association that is doing it? Are these contributions complementary, or are they substituting for the contributions of industry? And market building, if we think about it, it requires coordination to some degree. Is it the same for an organization, again, like Greenpeace, to engage in collective action with trade associations and startups versus working together with producers from the oil business? So that can create also some tension. So at the end of the day, what may matter more is not necessarily the presence of a single group of actors, but a configuration of actors in a given context and the interdependencies between them, if they're providing similar contributions or complementary contributions to the formation of the market, to establishing market legitimacy, to getting favorable regulation, and so on. And finally, the group of players that are part of moral markets and the interdependencies between them might change over time. So early on, these markets may be populated by the committed early movers, the ones that really care about the social or environmental cause. But what happens later when the moral market matures, when different kinds of players come in, it becomes more about big business and gross margins, and it makes it difficult for firms to coordinate. So how do these actors work together to collectively promote a market over the development of a moral market? So over the past few years with my collaborators, we've been working to try to put these pieces of the puzzle together. And of course, many have written about the impact of social movements on moral markets, including some of the other panelists who have done, as I mentioned, excellent research in this area. Some of these ideas are summarized in a recent article with Brandon Lee, Strategic Organization, where we also talk about, in more detail, about how social movements lead to greater organizational diversity and under what conditions this effect is likely to appear. So what are the firm attributes and the social movement attributes that kind of establish the boundary conditions? And right now, I'm currently working with Todd Schiffeling from Temple University to put together, or we're trying to put together the last two pieces of the puzzle. And this is very early stage work, so the data work is still evolving and also the conceptualization. So I just wanted to give you some kind of brief idea of what we're thinking here, but I'm happy to discuss these and other ideas with the panel and also with the audience, of course. So, so that's all from me. Thanks again for having me, and feel free to reach out for any questions or follow-up comments at any point now or later. For now, I'm really looking forward to the other presentations and to our discussions during the rest of the workshop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Panikos. Let's now move to the second speaker, Desiré Pacheco, who is going to give a presentation with the title Social Movement and Entrepreneurship. The floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. And today I decided I'm just broadly going to be talking about entrepreneurship and social movements. This allows me to tell you about many of my papers. So it's my convenient framing for discussing a few of my, some of my work. And so, like I said, it's great to be here. It's ironic that we're so close, yet it's been so far and it's taken this long for us to see each other in person. So 3 studies that I'll be talking about today. One has been published to our working papers, and then I'm going to talk about the general implications for future research in this space. The first paper, published in 2014 in Org Science, looking at the coevolution of industries, of social movements and institutions, is a study of the wind power energy sector in the US. And so with this paper, we started with the notion that there is a lot of variability in terms of looking at, okay, something went off there with the PowerPoint. So there was a lot of variation in terms of installations of wind power capacity throughout the US, as you can see here, and a lot of growth that we observed throughout the same time. Still blank there in the southeast of the country, but definitely a lot of other variation. And with that, what we observed was also the growth of this wind energy industry and specifically, clean energy social movement organizations is how we call them. These are some examples of them. I've worked with Renewable Northwest in Oregon, and these organizations really take the task of promoting clean, renewable energy for the most part. What we do with these organizations is we call them technology-focused SMOs. So we are calling them social movement organizations. They are distinct from trade associations. I don't have a lot of my time here to discuss those differences, but their funding is very different. It's based on grants, et cetera, and they don't just look at wind power or solar. They actually promote the whole spectrum of renewables. It could be wind, it could be solar, it could be geothermal, hydro, et cetera. And they do that in a way, and so as you will see here, if we look at the right-hand side here, they have much more narrow goals than what we would call a generalist SMO, which in the context of wind power, we're referring to the environmental SMOs. We saw them in Colorado, in Oregon, in all the states that we've done research in, also promoting renewables, but in a different way. And so they had a distinct role, and that's what I'll discuss now. The generalist SMOs, much more focused on environmental conservation, air quality, climate change. They have scale and scope advantages in terms of fundraising and shaping policy. And very important, these generalist SMOs have also different strategies. They very much are focused on campaigning against fossil fuel industry. So very much take a confrontational approach to change, where these specialist TSMOs have more narrow goals, but they still share the goal of improving the environment. That is still, when we've done a lot of qualitative research on the missions of these organizations, I just realized I still have my mask on. No wonder this was so hard. So many of these organizations do have an environmental sort of goal, and that's their mission, but they think of the technology as a means to get to that goal, the environmental goal. Much more specialized knowledge and capabilities. In fact, some of them do hire people from the industry to come in and bring that capability, and they're focused on stimulating generally the adoption of technology. During the same time, we saw a lot of differences when it came to policies. And renewable portfolio standards are the most important policy that we see in the US, where a state mandates that a certain percentage of the electricity in a state comes from renewables. Back then, when we did the study, 28 states had passed it, but a lot of variation in this area. So what we observed is that the growth of wind power in the US was influenced by these generalist environmental SMOs, but also by the specialist clean energy ones, was also influenced by the support of these more formalized policies. But at the same time, this is all explained in a complex coevolutionary process. And so we asked the question, how do SMOs, institutions, and the industry co-evolve to develop a new industry? And this was the model there. So now I'm going to take you in detail into every of these relationships. No, just kidding. So the social movement on our left-hand side, we see the generalist SMOs over there leading to mandatory rules. That's what typically we've seen observed in the literature. Oh, we have all of these NGOs and they're out there, they're pushing the industry through mandatory rules, in this case, to lead to industry growth, to lead to the growth of wind power. And our point is, the story doesn't end here. That's just the beginning. Having more industry growth and having more related knowledge in that industry actually leads to the growth of the specialist SMOs. And the specialist SMOs play a very important role. And their role is to continue to bring awareness and institutionalization in the industry, and also lead and influence the enactment of market incentives that are very specific for solar, for wind, for thermal. And it gets technical. At that point, we don't see the generalists getting that involved. It's these guys that are doing it. Keep pushing the industry overall. And so my point with this is to show that movements and industry and that relationship is complex. And it's much more complex than what we have seen and put out there, that this evolution is dependent not only, and one thing, that movements evolve not just because organizations within movements have to compete with each other, but also because movements depend on the industries that they are supporting. And so this evolution of the movement can be explained by the industries that they support. And in general, that there's, of course, a lot of dependencies across these populations, something that we must consider. I'll take you to the second paper. This is a working paper in solar energy, looking at social movement and entry and with an ecological perspective. As Panikos just described, there's a lot of research that tells us that SMO participation can lead to emerging industry entry. We just talked about that, but our question was, how does the ecology of the industry itself shape how the movement can help the industry? The movement is not going to be universally able to. What is it about the industry where the movement can sometimes be more helpful than other times? And with that, we actually did this project in the US solar energy contracting industry. In this industry, we also see a lot of variation across states in terms of the number of solar establishments. Same thing if you look at it in terms of solar energy capacity. And we also saw the intervention of these clean energy TSMOs. And so with that in mind, what we've done here is a model that looks at the participation of SMOs and emerging industry depending on that industry ecology. So SMOs here are much more influential at stimulating from entry when the industry ecology, where everything down here is actually less favorable to entry, right? So that makes sense in this, in looking at it. Well, we need these SMOs when the industry ecology is not providing the right environment. But how exactly is that? Well, it happens when the industry density is either very low, but also when it's too high, and you have too much competition. And so in those conditions, that's why we have a quadratic there, the movement ends up being more important. The movement is also more important when the density of mutualistic industries, these are industries that actually are highly interdependent and share the social values of this industry. In this case, wind power and solar. When wind power is very low, you need the movement more because you don't have that broader legitimacy of the category. Similarly, when the concentration of what we call generalist multi-products, these are firms that not only install solar power, but they also install heating systems and other things for homes and for residents and commercial. That might actually lead to less single product specialists, but we need the movement to help deal with the competition there. So overall, the ecology on its own leads to lower levels of cognitive legitimacy, but the movement can come and compensate for that by bringing the sociopolitical legitimacy that is lacking in the industry. So the implications of this study are that the structural conditions, like I mentioned, really matter in determining the effectiveness of movements. And really important, a lot of the research in social movements is very focused on agency. And our point is we also need to bring structure. And yes, the literature in social movement talks to us about political structures or political opportunities in that structure, but much less so on these ecological structures that we don't quite understand how that relates to movements. Final paper, this is a paper in sustainable apparel. And in this paper, we're looking at how entrepreneurs engage in cultural work and how they bring change into this industry in particular. And it's a US-based study. In the US, when it comes to apparel, the industry is moving slowly towards sustainability. I see much more activity here in Europe than we see in the US. In fact, when I started this paper, I thought I was going to study the movement. And then I realized there's no movement. But there is a little bit of a movement, and I'm going to show you it's a different kind of movement, but I think we need to consider it too. And so very limited intervention of the government here. A few NGOs are active. It's not your typical social movement. And incumbents like Nike, Patagonia, putting efforts out there through organizations like the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, but still slow progress. And many have criticized it for that. At the same time, what we notice is the new wave of entrepreneurs out there doing a lot of stuff on sustainable apparel. And so we put together our own database. I've been working on this project now for years because I've had to create everything from scratch, looking at the founding rates of sustainable apparel companies. And as you can see here, for those in our sample, many of them have been founded in the last 10 years or so. And so this is an inductive grounded theory paper looking at newspapers, company websites, interviews, etc., and very much focused on the emergence of the industry in the US. Some of the key things, I'm only going to take you through a little piece of this paper that's related to social movements. And that is that entrepreneurs seem to be in a very unique position to advance change in the industry because also, as Panikos was mentioning, their authenticity allows them to engage in what we call productive cultural work. these entrepreneurs very much have and portray a craftsmanship identity. We are craftsmen. And that gives them the license to now go and use culture to criticize the others and to bring change into the industry. And so they apply that craft logic to bridge the environmental and the economic logic. This paper really is a logics paper, but I'm gonna now take you a little bit through the movement. This is the movement piece. And here what I want to highlight is that these entrepreneurs, yes, they leverage a sustainable lifestyle movement. They talk a lot about you are vegan, outdoors. You know, this is about lifestyle. This is not just about your apparel. This is about other choices that you make. And in leveraging that movement and that lifestyle movement, they also embed their practices both in the local community by teaching, for example, different garment making skills and getting out there and talking about that, and also through cultural forms of expression. A lot of fashion shows, art exhibits, etc. Right? So they're truly using culture to bring that. They don't just leverage the movement, they also reinforce it with how they're doing this. And so here's an example of a quote. The inspiration behind this collection is to bring awareness of the human impact on environment and to promote social responsibility by adopting sustainable fashion as a lifestyle choice. So it's all about, this is the general choice that you make. The implications of this paper for social movement theory, and sort of where I want to bring it here to your attention, is that there's been a lot of work on thinking about collective action, the collective action perspective of movements. In fact, perhaps we should start with the definition of movement, since this is a workshop in social movements, and perhaps many of you would have collective action in your mind. And my point is, let's maybe think about movements more broadly. There's also cultural and lifestyle movements. There's been literature in this. We're using it in this paper, but I think there's a lot of opportunity to continue doing that. It's a softer type of movement that does and actually relate to the stronger form of movement that we're typically used to. So putting all of these papers together, the message I want to leave you with is that social movements can be beyond contestation through collective action, like I just said, that we can think of them in terms of lifestyle and cultural movements. And I'll leave you with my final thought, which is entrepreneurship is about change, social movements is about change. So when that change and the direction of that change is aligned, then the question is, how complementary are these efforts? And we're just starting to scratch the surface there. And then on the other side, if they're not aligned, then what are the implications? We see research that tells us that the visibility of a company matters when it comes to whether a movement goes after them. The bigger you are, the more likely you're going to be hit by a movement. But how small can you be to be under the radar? And are entrepreneurs and small businesses really immune to movements? I don't think we really know enough of that to understand it. Thank you. These are just some thoughts. I look forward to discussing it more with you.
Thank you very much, Desiré. Let's now move to our third speaker. She's Simone Schiller-Merkens, and Simone is going to give a presentation with the title Organizing Toward an Alternative Economy, Social Movements and Alternative Organizing. Simone, the floor is yours.
So, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, can you see it? Okay, perfect. So I'm very pleased to be here and being part of this workshop. So compared to the other two presentations that we just heard, mine will be a bit different, and that is based on conceptual work on the one hand, and on the other hand, it might be the most radical one, or more on the social movement side. We have heard a lot on social movements or movements within markets, in industrial markets, and I'm going to talk more about movements that are already organizing toward a change, also outside of markets. So whereas we were supposed to talk a bit about social movements and more markets, I will broaden it a bit and look also at social movements in the economy, or what has been called economic activism, which is activism that takes place in and through markets, but not only so. So the focus of my talk will be on so-called prefigurative movements, which are movements that organize their economic exchanges in alternative ways, both within markets but also outside of them. And I'm going to talk about that because they are important actors in bringing a new economy about. And we are going to talk about digital economy later, so maybe that'd be helpful. So we currently live in an era of multiple interwoven crises: the global pandemic, climate change, high levels of inequality, poverty, and further threats to our democracies through racism and the rise of populism. These crises have intensified the debate about our current economic system, and there are many who see these major challenges related to the kind of economy in which we currently live. Critical voices not only relate to the neoliberal policies that brought about the expansion of markets to ever more spheres of our lives. Many also claim that the underlying principles of our economy, profit maximization, competition, and economic growth, have led to the exploitation of both people and the planet. So we might ask them, are there any alternatives to our predominant ways of organizing the economy? Well, indeed, there are. On the one hand, there are theoretical models for an alternative economy. So just think about a few of them, like participatory economics, degrowth economy, community economics. But there are also movements already implicated in building alternatives on the ground, and this is what we are going to look at now. So, for instance, we have, particularly in German-speaking countries, the movement Economy for the Common Good, and the creation of common good organizations, where the idea is that the central values of firms should be to primarily work for human dignity, solidarity, and sustainability. Then we have the long tradition of cooperatives that witness a revival, and also in relation to several movements, such as degrowth or democratizing work. We have community-supported agriculture, where new relationships based on the principle of solidarity are created between food producers and consumers. There are eco-villages, there are worker-recovered enterprises, particularly in Latin America, usually also organized as cooperatives. And there are many more, such as social solidarity economy movement, with many social enterprises in the world attached to it. What unites all of these initiatives and makes them alternatives is that they try to realize alternative moral values in their practices. And we can draw on the late Eric Olin Wright, who was one of the most prolific writers on social transformation. And he proposed a set of principles, including equality and fairness, democracy and freedom, and community and solidarity. Or we can equally build on Martin Parker and his colleagues, who define alternative organizations as organizations that realize the values of autonomy, solidarity, and responsibility. So despite the great variety between these organizations and communities, they also all are united in that they pursue an activist agenda. So meaning that all of them seek to change the economy. They all try to create a better economy in the present and already live in alternative ways in their daily practices. And this is why they are also referred to as prefigurative social movements. All of the mentioned examples show that movements have started to construct alternatives, and this is a fundamental shift in their activism. Originally, social movements mainly targeted the political arena, and to effectuate changes in the economy, they demanded appropriate regulatory changes from the state. Today, movements also engage in economic activism. They directly intervene into the economy and what we heard before. And that includes both protest actions, such as boycotts or demonstration, and constructive forms of activism, like contributing to the construction of moral markets. And this also is something Also, what pertains to this area is called prefiguration. In prefiguration, movements use direct social action, whereby they focus upon directly transforming some aspects of society by means of the very action itself. So you can also say that movements engage in prefigurative politics, which means that their ongoing social practices embody their goals and visions of an alternative future. We can also say that through their practices, they live the change they want to see in the economy as a whole. This shift toward prefiguration became most visible in the wake of the Great Recession, particularly in Southern Europe and, of course, also very much in Spain, that was hit hard by the austerity measures. A lot of solidarity initiatives were created during that time, such as food banks, collective purchasing groups, or free legal and medical services. Together with the examples we have just seen, all of them constitute a fundamental change in how economic goods are produced, consumed, and distributed or shared, and thereby they prefigure how an alternative economy might look like. This is why social transformation scholars consider these prefigurative initiatives as core actors in transforming our economies. Wright refers to them as real utopias. They allow insights into an alternative way of life that seems utopian for some, but these organizations are already there. They are real and show that an alternative organizing of economic exchanges is feasible. But when we look at them, most of them emerge at the margins of society, in free spaces and niches that allow them to be different. They are fringe alternatives, not widely perceived as viable on a broader scale. So alternative organizing is still mainly taking place at the local level, on the ground of particular organizations and communities. The central questions are then, how can their values, beliefs, and practical embodiments of alternative organizing become more widespread in society? How can these prefigurative movements organize toward an alternative economy? Wright would say that these are tricky research questions because they are addressing a future that is not yet there. But we can theorize about them by building on existing research, and there's an extensive body of studies on the collective action of movements, and we just heard it. In particular, informative are studies that look into the outcome of movements and the question of when and how movements matter. So building on social movement studies tells us two main things about how movements matter and contribute to social change. One is they need to get support from political and rule-setting actors and institutions. They need to find influential allies, and this also includes powerful allies beyond the political arena, like in science or the economy and markets. The other important thing is that movements have to mobilize between themselves. They have to build connections between the different prefigurative movements, between, let's say, common good organizations, post-growth organizations, and social enterprises of various sorts. And they do so both by creating brokering organizations that help them to do so, and by using digital tools. And this is something I'm sure that we're going to talk about later during our workshop. When we look at the scholarship on social transformation, they also claim that these two things are important. So creating connections both within the movement sector and to the political arena. For Wright, it is even the most promising way toward an alternative economy. So combining the collective action in civil society, where alternatives are already prefigured in free spaces, with interventions from the state to expand those spaces. Social movement scholarship is also helpful to theorize about when prefigurative movements are likely to organize toward an alternative economy. So what are the contextual conditions for having an impact? But I think for reasons of time, I will go to the next slides now. So, of course, any transformation of our economy would be a contentious process, rife with struggles. And here we can build on insights not only from social movement studies, but also we have all the studies on alternative organizing, hybrid organizations, social entrepreneurship, and institutional change. Struggles arise within and between prefigurative movements, such as when hierarchical authority relations develop unintendedly, despite the ideal of horizontality. Also, when we look at the heterogeneity of actors who are currently involved in prefigurative organizations, there's a great variety of ideas, beliefs, and collective identities, and that will cause contestation and moral struggles about, for instance, the most appropriate practices of alternative organizing, about how to achieve social transformation, so the strategy of social transformation, about whether to collaborate with the state or incumbent economic actors or not, or about accepting formal structures in the form of brokering organizations. In particular, the last two aspects are particularly critical, or an issue would be an issue for initiatives that have a more anarchist identity. Furthermore, there will also be struggles in relation to the context and the connections to outside actors. The rise of counter-movements is very likely, particularly when we consider that the moral principles of alternative organizing are conflicting with the ones that currently dominate our economy. Struggles can also arise in collaborations with firms and public authorities, and we know about the threats of co-optation or mission drift. So to conclude, the question of how organizations and communities that prefigure an alternative economy can help us organizing toward it on a broader scale is an important one when we look at the serious problems that we face in the world. And it provides us with a lot of research questions. For example, we need to better understand how these prefigurative movements engage in collective action, what major struggles arise in their everyday activities, and how they tackle them, how and under which conditions prefigurative organizations achieve which kinds of outcomes beyond their own boundaries, and thereby contribute to a broader social change. We can also look into the question of whether and how crises like the pandemic or economic recessions affect prefigurative movements and the diffusion of alternative organizing. So yes, there's already research on alternative organizing, on hybrid organizations, social enterprises, time banks, fair trade organizations, cooperatives. And we have learned a lot about the struggles of organizing differently. But our insights mostly derive from case studies that focus on particular kinds of prefigurative organizations. We do not know yet what happens when these start mobilizing among each other to collectively work towards changing our economies. And that brings me to my final thought is, well, we might also rethink our research more generally. What I have talked about is not something that we can directly observe and practice. Well, of course, alternative organizing exists, and we do have studies on alternative organizations. But neither do we see the envisioned connections across them, at least not on a larger scale, nor are there any fundamental outcomes on the economy that can be related back to their collective action. This is why I share with others the belief that we should continue exploring these real utopias that do exist, but also theorize about the possible trajectories of transformation and the conditions to, outcomes of, and struggles around them. And this is something that involves, to quote Wright, more speculative and contentious claims about what could be, and not just about what is. Ali and Juliane Reinecke recently also wrote about it. They said that in the light of the performative role of science, we should theorize about the future to help bringing about a desirable one. This is important also because we thereby co-create more positive imaginaries of the future. We do have all the talk about the serious problems, which is very important indeed. But people are also looking for ideas on how a positive future might look like, and they want to know what to do, how to get there. We as researchers should therefore continue working on what Parker described as a positive critique which brings new things into the world. Wright called it a social science of the possible. It is a science that provides imaginaries of a desirable and positive future. Thank you very much.
Simone, Well, now it's time to open this session for a debate. We encourage all the audience that is online and in the room just to start. Those who are online, you can submit your questions through the chat. Let's start if there's anybody in the room who wants to start. Make any questions to any of the three speakers. David, please.
Thank you to the three panelists for a very interesting first session. There was a concept that came to my mind immediately in the first, in the first paper, and I finally saw it in one of the final slides that Simone shared with us, which is the concept of mission drift. I'm more interested individually. I mean, my interest has always been in how social movements are being transformed by markets, not the other way around. So not even a critique, but my comment to the first two presentation is that, in a way, your point of departure is very static about how the way that social movements are and are going to be. And obviously, we need to discount that there is a dual effect of social movements transforming markets. But again, as an activist, I'm more interested into what Sandel, the philosopher, would call the crowding out of intrinsic motivation, intrinsic values. So this cooptation that appeared in the final slide, one of the final slides of Simone's presentation. And here I might take, and I'm not an expert on mission drift, but it's a worry that troubles me, is what is your knowledge about this other side of the coin, about how markets transform social movements, how co-opt them, and can we be a bit optimistic about the other side of the coin that you didn't show that much? Thank you very much.
Yeah, any of the three would like to start answering?
Can we give a quick answer, if that's okay? I don't think we have a full answer because a lot of the research, I think you actually characterized the literature quite well, because there's certainly a lot of research looking at mission drift and cooptation of social movements, but especially in the area of organizations and management economics, most of that has been focusing on thinking about how that affects the development of the market, right? So the mainstreaming of the market or the failure for the market to become mainstream, rather than thinking about how that affects activists themselves. So I think you actually pointed out to an interesting opportunity for future work and also for informing practice, because while there is some work in sociology in terms of how cooptation of social movement organizations occurs, there's certainly not enough that we know about this. I think going back to also what Desi was saying, the social movements and markets, they co-evolve, right? So one certainly affects the other, and we usually think about only one side, one direction. We usually think about the direction of how they affect market outcomes rather than social movement outcomes. So I'll leave it at that. I hope that's some.
Thank you.
I'll point out that I think that is a very good comment, and there is so much opportunity in that space, because there is, like Panikos says, very little that we understand. I think to that regard, an example that comes to mind for me is organic foods in the U.S., a movement that began, and now we see certification. But many farmers will actually argue that what the market did by putting the certification was minimalize the efforts that needed to be done and set it up as a checklist. And so have we seen an uprise of that? No. But the question is, do sometimes movement just strike back and say, no, this is not what we asked from the market? And I'm just invite us all to think about if we've seen those examples out there and how we might be able to explore this further. Because indeed, sometimes in these types of examples, the market takes the demands of the movement, but makes it their own into what's convenient. and available to with the economic logic. And so what comes next after that? I don't know that we know enough about that. So great comment.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you again. I also agree with my colleagues that, of course, there's so much work missing on social movement organizations, social movements themselves, and the question of mission drift. One thing is, I mean, there is work on the collective identity on the organizational identity of social movement organizations, and that some of them are, such as Greenpeace, for instance, they would not collaborate with firms. So they have more a confrontational tactic, or they employ confrontational tactics to influence markets and the economy, whereas others are more lean towards collaborating with firms and in that way, and these are particularly have difficulties in remaining, as activists as before, as radical maybe as before. I can also, I mean, I don't know, I haven't analyzed by myself social movement organizations, but I have analyzed activist entrepreneurs in the ethical fashion market. And what I have seen over time is that indeed that the longer they are in the business and the longer they have to show that they are also a respectable and legitimate part of the fashion industry as a whole, the more they turn towards using economic and business logics to position themselves in the market. So yes, it is true that even they keep their activist agenda, at least in their positioning outwards, they won't, this will be crowded out over time.
Okay, let me read one question that is in the chat before we give the opportunity to the audience here. There's one question which I guess is for Simone. The question says, the comment says, theorizing is good and start from academia. How this reaches critical mass to realize this alternative economy?
Sorry, can you repeat the question, the last sentence?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it's for Simone, but if any from the three want to react, it's,
yeah.
It says, theorizing is a good and a start from academia. How does this reach critical mass to realize this alternative economy?
Okay. So behind this question, I read that you think that the critical mass is, or that we can only reach a critical mass through collaborating with economic actors. Is that so? And if we understand it like that, I would say, yes, indeed, that might be one aspect. So we need more research also about what happens then to these social movement organizations and also to economic actors. Do they transform truly the way markets and the economy works, or is it more that the movements become co-opted? And I want to go to another question that is related. So we might also want to talk about our understanding of what a moral market is, because as far as I see it, is we talk a lot about moralized markets right now, which means that market actors, that firms now start moralizing by using moral values, to position themselves and to legitimate their doing in different ways. But the question is, we see so much moralization around. So I would say in every industry, we now have moralization going on. As you meant, every firm, each firm says that they are sustainable, that they are respecting the values of the nature of the people, and so on. So the question then becomes: are these all working in moral markets, or are these just moralized markets? And do we need a difference between moralized markets and moral markets, where moral markets are the ones where the economic principles are balanced, or maybe even subsumed under the moral values? So I'm not sure. So maybe we can discuss that with the audience as well.
Thank you very much, Simone.
Yes, can you hear me? Yes. Thank you so much for the session. Super interesting. Actually, I have a couple of questions. One was related with something that Simone was saying now, and I know that's kind of a tricky question to ask is, I mean, what do we mean? And I know that you have been confronted with this for years, I assume. What actually moral means when we talk about moral markets, right? And this is connected with the second question, which is also like a puzzle that I have, which is that, so in the different presentations, there seems to me that there is an absent actor, which is the state, right? So what is the role of the state in these different pictures, right? So for instance, thinking about Desiré's presentation, which I found it super interesting, right? But now I couldn't stop thinking about what is going on here in Europe, but in particular in Spain, when we talk about, so we see an emergence of I don't know where they are coming from, entrepreneurs offering clean energy and so on and so forth. So I was wondering, is this related with any sort of social movements? Is it related with, is an opportunity that they see? And of course, it is related with the state, it is related with the next generation thing, right? So what is the role of the state in all the pictures that we have here, the different stories that you are telling, right? So again, I was saying, is this like the absent actor that we have? Because also I was thinking about somehow, and perhaps this is my own bias, I was thinking about the work of Flickstein, right? And Flickstein talks about the importance of the state as the fundamental, one of the fundamental actors defining market institutions. So in some of the industries you're referring to, the state has been there defining the rules, setting the pillars of what he calls the market there. So what is actually there? And actually, I was also thinking about this. I'll stop it there. When hearing Simone, because actually, one thing that is very interesting about a number of these prefigurative initiatives or movements that you were referring to, some of them, not all of them, but some of them, they actually try to make a deliberate movement to escape, to move out, right, from the society. And partly because they consider that there is no institutional channels that they can use in order to transform the reality, right? So again, plenty of different things. But again, thanks so much for a very thoughtful session. Thank you.
Thank you. Any reaction?
I'll start with your last question on the state role of the state, and then maybe. So to your point, I mean, absolutely, I think the role of the state is crucial. And if I underrepresented that in my presentation, I think it's important to highlight that it isn't. In fact, when we look at, in general, social movement theory, where all this started was really looking at how movements were changing and transforming policies, all the way from civil rights movement, and we see it now with the environmental movement and all of that. And so perhaps if it's less represented is because it's trying to rebalance the fact that so much of social movement theory was based on transforming and changing state level action. And so in my model, everything that I had in the middle in that in the first model, that's all state level. And that's all coming from the government enacting that. The point is the movement starting the mobilization to eventually convince the state to make those changes. And so indeed, but very important and very crucial, because on the one hand, I think there's different mechanisms and pathways that we see with social movements. They work directly to the individual, to the consumer. They work to the industry, but also indirectly through government. And those are all very important pathways to consider. And I try to look at all of them in my research together because, and that's why it gets very complex, because we have indirect and direct pathways to changing industry and consumer behavior as well.
So let me add to that as well, because I definitely agree that this is a very important comment. And as Desiré said, a lot of the research on social movements started by looking at how they influence state policy. So we are actually not the majority of, in terms of studying markets and market outcomes. I mean, in an ideal world, we would probably not need social movements in the sense that, the moralization of markets would be kind of enforced by the state. But of course, some of the reasons why social movements appear and they are becoming, in general, civil society is becoming more and more prominent is because of limited state intervention in some markets. So that's one of the reasons maybe why it was underrepresented in our presentations, although I think in much of the work that we discussed, the state is very prominent as well. The other thing that's important is that one of the main ways by which social movements influence markets or modern markets is by changing or helping to change state regulation, right? So you mentioned the example of clean tech companies in Spain, and there, in some of my research as well, I've seen that the state policies have been really fundamental for the development of the industry, but also for the demise of the industry. So when policies, supporting policies were gone, then you would see like a very steep decline. So it still remains one of the, especially at the early stages of these markets, being able to influence state and state policy is probably the most important mechanism to actually change the market.
Thank you, Panikos.
Yes, and I think we might add to that. I mean, it's, on the one hand, we really need the rule-setting role of the state is very important, also to further shape the transformation of markets toward more moral ones. On the other hand, also, this is something that Eric Olin Wright discusses a lot, and other researchers as well, that we look at social transformation, is the question of how the state beyond rule setting can also support these the emergence and the development of these alternative organizations. And one is also to give to provide them with various kind of resources, not only financial ones but also social ones, in terms of helping them to cooperate, to communicate. And maybe we can talk about later also how digitalization can contribute to that. Yes. So, thank you, Ignacy.
Let me read one question. It's coming from the chat, which relates to the last comment made by Ignacy in the first question, which reads as follows. It says, don't we need to problematize morality? For example, financial traders, CEOs, fascists, and so forth have moral codes and applied rules, correct? So I think this relates to the first comment from Ignacy about the concept of moral. No? Any reaction about that, linking the first question from Ignacy with these questions from the chat?
So there are two views on what is moral. One is that moral is something that is constructed by a certain community. And the other one is that it is already given. So, but I can tell you what when I talk about moral markets, my understanding is maybe a more radical one, which is these markets are moral when they are alternative, when they are based on the set of alternative principles that I just described. So, and that means that we can really reflect upon whether all of these markets that we have talked about are really moral markets or not more moralized markets, where some values become important, but the most prominent ones remain the economic ones. And I think moral markets are alternative markets where the most prominent values are not the economic ones. They might be balanced, but they are not the most important ones. So that's my understanding. Might be a bit radical, yes.
Thank you very much. Yes, let's go to another question.
Hello. Yes. It became clear to me in the different presentations that there were that the role of social movements to transform industry practices and markets is key, but also that there are different types of social movements, the more general ones, more, I don't know how you call it, technologically specific social movements, or these prefigurative movements. And this kind of variety, I wasn't clear if you see it as, in a way, as an advantage or as a disadvantage if we want to promote a transformation that is needed to face our social environmental challenges. In other words, the variety is a good thing because they complement each other, and at the end, this is driving change, or is becoming an obstacle for collaboration and to create greater change. I don't know if you have a view about this issue.
So let me try to give a quick answer. I think it also relates to one of the comments earlier. Somebody was talking about whether we should be satisfied with like a transformation, like a, let's say, incremental changes versus radical approach, right? And some of the problems that Simone mentioned require that we really change the way we organize our economy and markets really fast, right? So especially if we're talking about things like climate change. And I think to go back to your comment, I think we do need different types of movements and different types of efforts. On one hand, we can try to change, markets, how to use how markets work in order to get more favorable social and environmental outcomes, right? But at the same time, we also need to think about how we transform, what markets really are, right? And the value, infuse these values that Simone was talking about into markets, rather than thinking about the kind of traditional profit maximization approach. I'm not sure one way or the other is going to be more effective in terms of kind of moving fast. I think we probably need to work on both at the same time, given the challenges that we're facing and how quickly we need to transform. But certainly, I wouldn't think that we need to focus on only one or the other. But that's, of course, speculative.
Okay, of course.
I think of your question, I think it's a very good question, Daniel, in two ways. One is that change requires, and I'm going back to institutional change. And I think institutions come in different forms. And we can think about governance structures at the very top, the very formal institutions that economists would typically tell us. And then it can go all the way down to much more informal institutions, values, culture, norms. And so as we go down that spectrum of institutions, we need different strategies to tackle them. Because in my view, if we're talking about formal institutions, going back to the point that was made here, we need more of the typical collective action movement, where if we're going all the way down to the very structure of our culture and our values, yes, collective action is also perhaps important, but that's where I start to see the other types of movements and organizing as influencing it. And so in terms of institutions, because there are different types, I think there are different movements that are necessary for those types. Then just generally speaking, when we think about the nature of the problems as well that we have to tackle, I can see how, and because with the nature of the problem comes the nature of the stakeholders that need to come in. We're trying to transform entire systems, and the systems have different stakeholders. And when that stakeholder is a large corporation, very often we need collective action. And that will lead us to bigger change, indeed. But we also need to, and I've actually created, I have a totally different paper that I didn't bring in today that talks about the systems and the different stakeholders and the different strategies that are necessary to tackle those different stakeholders. And I think all of them are important because all stakeholders matter. From a market perspective, the large industrial players matter, but so does the consumer, because the consumer drives the demand for that particular player. And so I think to address consumers, we do need more of these softer types of movements. So I'd love to talk to you more about it later, but.
Okay, thank you very much, Desiré. Well, it's time. I know there's some questions probably during coffee break or at the end, it's good time. There's also some comments in the chat, something that self-referential for us who are in business schools, like how should business schools curriculums change in this context? Okay, something food for thought and further discussion during the coffee break, probably. So now it's time to the end of this first session. We have arrived to the end. So thank you very much to the three speakers for sharing your research and engaging us in such a rich debate. So thank you very much. A big applause.
Thank you.
I will present the takeaway summary from the three first presenters, speakers. We had Panikos Georgallis, who presented research that has examined the effect of social movements on the structures of moral markets. And one interesting thing was how he was considering the organizational identity of the entrance into the market. And he made a recommendation, a suggestion of 4 components that have to be taken into account when studying research on the evolution of moral markets. He mentioned the idea of the contributions of social movement organizations, the organizational heterogeneity, the interdependencies and configuration of actors, and the changes over time. And our second speaker, Desiré Pacheco, put emphasis or made a call for more for a structural emphasis of social movement research. Basically, she emphasized the mutual shaping relationship between social movement and industry structure, and also in the last paper, she emphasized the importance of the lifestyle and cultural work for the social movement and an entrepreneur. And Desiré, to some extent, advocated for a cross-fertilization, let me use this word, between the literature on social movement and entrepreneurship when she was talking about the idea of change being present in both. And finally, the third speaker, Simone Schiller-Merkens, well, let's say that she make a call for theorizing social science that not only focuses on the actual, let me use the word, but also to focus on the virtual, so they say the space of possibilities, no? And the idea was that let's try to actualize the desirable futures by theorizing them, no? To me, and with all respect, because I'm more coming from the engineering side, it reminds me which is the work of artists or the work of engineers, which is about devising the future and designing solutions for that. No, I think this metaphor could be applied to the idea of theorization. No? And that's my summary takeaways from the first table.